The story opens in midair, where a tense and humiliating confrontation explodes between a powerful figure and a vulnerable teen. The arrogance of authority collides with the quiet dignity of the young passenger, setting the stage for an unexpected storm. Symbols of power and resistance clash, ending in a cliffhanger that promises a shocking twist. "Sit down and shut up. You think this is your bus, boy?" The voice ripped through the cabin like thunder. Every head jerked toward the source of the insult. Row 17, right side, where a tall white pilot in uniform loomed over a slim black teenager. The hum of the engine suddenly felt quieter, as if the airplane itself was listening. The cabin lights glowed dim yellow, trays half filled with plastic cups and crumpled napkins scattered across armrests. Passengers froze with forks midair, parents pulled children closer, and a group of businessmen glanced at each other, uneasy but silent. The boy, 16, wiry, his hoodie sleeves tugged down over nervous hands, sat upright, eyes wide but steady. He hadn't spoken yet. His chest rose and fell quickly, but his lips stayed sealed. He wasn't trembling. Not yet. The pilot's shadow cut across him like a blade. "People like you think rules don't apply," the man spat, voice sharp enough to slice through steel. His polished shoes planted hard on the carpet, his captain's wings glinting under the overhead light. The arrogance wasn't just in his words, but in the way he leaned in, claiming ownership of the air between them. Gasps fluttered across the aisle. A woman in the row behind whispered, "Is this really happening?" But no one dared raise their voice. The weight of hierarchy, uniform, authority, whiteness was pressing down on every soul in that fuselage. The teen adjusted his seatbelt slowly, deliberately. He didn't fidget or look away. His silence was louder than the man's shouting. Inside, his mind raced. Don't give him what he wants. Don't flinch. Don't let them see you fold. Then came the symbolic strike. With a swift tug, the pilot snatched the boy's boarding pass from the tray table, crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it onto the floor. The paper fluttered like a wounded bird against the aisle carpet. The boy bent down, picked it up, smoothed it out carefully on his knee, and stared at it, not as trash, but as proof of his place here. The cabin held its breath. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, low but sharp enough to pierce the captain's facade. "You can ground my paper, sir, but not me." A ripple spread, passengers shifting, eyes widening, some covering their mouths. The pilot blinked, momentarily thrown by the boy's poise. That second of silence felt like a storm front rolling in, and then, just as the engines roared a little louder beneath them, an overhead chime echoed through the cabin. The seatbelt sign dinged, but the sound was different. A voice cut through the speakers, urgent, unfamiliar, and cold. "Attention passengers, this aircraft is being rerouted immediately." Remain seated, every heart lurched, forks clattered to trays. The captain's face drained of color. The boy's eyes flickered toward the intercom, then back at the man towering over him. A faint, knowing half-smile touched his lips. The cabin wasn't just listening now. It was waiting. Cliffhanger. Something was about to unravel, and the plane itself was about to bear witness. The chime still echoed in their ears, unnaturally sharp, as if the airplane itself had spoken. Remain seated. The voice from the intercom had been sterile, clipped, and not the captain's. That realization struck the passengers like lightning. If it wasn't the man towering in the aisle, then who had seized the intercom? The captain's jaw tightened. He straightened, tugged at his uniform jacket, and barked into the cabin. "Ignore that. Just a system glitch." But his tone cracked at the edges, betraying unease. No one moved. Mothers clutched their children closer, businessmen closed their laptops, and elderly passengers exchanged nervous glances. Silence stretched across the rows, taut and heavy. The black teen sat still, the crumpled boarding pass balanced carefully on his knee. His fingers pressed it flat like preserving a fragile truth. His gaze didn't waver from the pilot. Calm, patient, watching. The captain snapped his fingers at the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with blonde hair pulled tight into a bun. "Fix the system," he hissed under his breath, though loud enough for those around to hear. His arrogance hadn't vanished, it simply trembled beneath the surface. The attendant's eyes darted between the teen and the captain. Her lips parted, but no words came. She turned and hurried toward the galley, shoulders rigid like a soldier retreating from battle. The engines hummed louder, vibrating the floor beneath the passengers' shoes. A low rumble of turbulence rippled through the cabin, shaking cups and rattling trays. The air carried unease, thick as smoke. Inside, the boy's thoughts burned like quiet embers. He can shout, he can tear paper, but he can't erase me. Everyone saw. Everyone heard. His power is slipping, and he knows it. The pilot leaned closer, voice sharp as a blade. Listen here. You keep your mouth shut, or I'll have you in cuffs when we land. The boy tilted his head slightly, his calm cutting deeper than rage. If you land. The line slid out softly, but it struck the air like a bell. Rows of passengers stirred. A man in business attire frowned, whispering to his colleague, "Did you hear that? If you land?" The captain's face reddened. He straightened, glaring down the aisle, daring anyone to challenge him. None did. But the silence wasn't submission anymore. It was something heavier, judgment gathering like storm clouds. At the back of the plane, the intercom crackled again. A different voice now, firm, male, and undeniably official. Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, this flight has been grounded. We are rerouting. Please remain calm. Gasps swept the cabin. Some passengers clutched armrests, others covered their mouths. The captain froze. His own authority had been stripped in front of his passengers. His wings gleamed, but they no longer commanded the air. The boy leaned back, his eyes never leaving the man towering over him. The engines groaned, tilting the plane slightly as it began to change course. For the first time, the captain stepped back, and in that step, the balance of power shifted, but the cabin, tense and electric, knew this was only the beginning of something far greater than turbulence. The tilt of the plane settled, engines humming steady again, but the tension inside the cabin only sharpened. The passengers weren't simply travelers anymore, they were spectators, each gaze drawn toward row 17. A baby whimpered softly. A mother rocked her child, whispering, "Shh, it's okay," though her own hands trembled. The businessmen in row 12 whispered urgently, trading theories about rerouting, about legal trouble, about who had really seized the intercom. But the common thread through every row was the same. Eyes, locked on the black teen and the captain. The pilot tugged once more at his jacket, desperate to reassert authority. His voice cut through the silence like brittle glass. Everyone calm down. This situation is under control. Yet no one looked reassured. His words fell flat, empty of weight. The boy lifted his chin, meeting the pilot's glare without blinking. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet his presence carried more gravity than the uniform in front of him. His mind whispered, "I'm not alone anymore. They see you. They see me." Across the aisle, an older woman in a green scarf whispered audibly, "Why is he shouting at a child?" Her neighbor hushed her, but the words lingered, hanging like smoke in the air. The pilot snapped, turning toward her. "Ma'am, stay out of this." The sudden lash drew a ripple of disapproval across the rows. Murmurs grew, low, restless voices swelling like a tide. The boy's eyes flickered, catching every reaction. Each whisper was a stone added to the crumbling wall of authority the captain clung to. A symbolic moment arrived, the crumpled boarding pass still on his knee. Slowly, deliberately, the teen folded it into a sharp-cornered square, transforming the torn scrap into something neat, whole again. Passengers noticed. A man in the aisle seat leaned forward, watching the small act with quiet awe. The pilot sneered. "Don't think that trick impresses anyone," but it did. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore, it was solidarity. The passengers were no longer hiding behind lowered eyes. They were staring openly now. At him. His arrogance wavered, panic creeping beneath the surface. "They're supposed to be on my side. They're supposed to trust me." The boy finally spoke, his voice calm, unhurried. "They don't have to trust me. They just need to see you." The words dropped into the cabin like lead. The murmurs swelled louder. A teenager with headphones around his neck muttered, "He's right." A father with his daughter in his lap clenched his jaw, muttering to himself. The captain turned, scanning the rows, realizing the faces looking back at him weren't deferential. They were evaluating, condemning. For the first time, he wasn't the unquestioned authority in the sky. He was a man, cornered by truth with nowhere to land. Then the intercom clicked again, a voice steady, clear, official. "Captain, please return to the cockpit immediately." Gasps swept the cabin. The order wasn't a request. It was command. The pilot froze, fists tight at his sides. His face burned crimson. But he couldn't disobey. He turned sharply, marching back up the aisle. Each step away felt like an admission of defeat. The boy watched him go, then pressed the folded square tighter between his fingers. The cabin breathed again. But this time, every breath carried the weight of unity. The aisle stretched long and narrow as the captain stormed forward, his polished shoes striking the carpet with a rhythm of anger. Each step seemed louder than the engines themselves, echoing like gavel strikes in a courtroom. When the cockpit door finally closed behind him, the atmosphere shifted. A deep, unsettled quiet washed over the rows. It wasn't relief, it was the stillness after lightning when everyone waits for the thunder to follow. The teen sat unmoved, his folded boarding pass resting neatly in his palm. His shoulders loosened, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the cabin not as a victim but as someone who understood. They saw. They can't unsee. Passengers exchanged murmurs, fragments of conversations breaking the silence. That was out of line. Grounding the plane. There must be more to this. Why would the captain yell at a child? Every whisper traveled, weaving an invisible net of judgment around the absent man in the cockpit. Near the back, a young mother shifted her baby to her shoulder, meeting the teen's eyes for a fleeting second. She didn't speak, but the nod she gave him was small, deliberate and filled with weight. He returned it with the faintest lift of his chin. For the first time, he wasn't carrying the silence alone. Meanwhile, the pilot's voice crackled faintly through the door, muffled yet urgent. He was arguing. Words like protocol, incident, and control bled through the walls, though no full sentences reached the passengers. His authority, once untouchable, now sounded like desperation. Inside his head, his thoughts churned violently. I am the captain. They must obey me. If I lose them, I lose everything. He's just a kid. Why is everyone looking at me like I'm the one on trial? Back in the cabin, turbulence shivered through the fuselage, a small shake that rattled cups and sent a few trays sliding an inch. Gasps erupted but quickly hushed. Fear of the sky had fused with unease about the man steering the plane. The teen's calm presence became a strange anchor. He unfolded the square of his boarding pass again, smoothing it flat one last time, then tucked it into the seat pocket in front of him. It wasn't trash, it was testimony waiting, a symbolic gesture, quiet but clear. I belong here. My proof stays with me, not in his hands, passengers noticed. The man across the aisle whispered, "That's strength," shaking his head in disbelief. The intercom popped again, jolting everyone. This time it wasn't the captain. A new voice, authoritative yet measured, filled the cabin. "This is First Officer Daniels. Please remain calm. We are following new instructions from air traffic control. Everything is under control." But the word control no longer rang the way it used to. Passengers looked at each other, eyes wide with suspicion. The very idea of control now seemed fragile, fractured. The boy leaned back in his seat, gaze fixed forward, his silence daring anyone to deny his presence. And though no one spoke aloud, the entire cabin knew. The weight of authority had shifted. The cockpit door stayed shut, its locked surface becoming a wall between power and witness. But power doesn't vanish behind a door. It leaks, it seeps, it cracks. Through the cabin, muffled voices carried a heated argument. The captain's tone, sharp and frantic, bled through the barrier. "You undermined me in front of them." The first officer's steadier voice answered, though not every word was clear. "Protocol. Rerouted. Not your call anymore." Passengers leaned forward, straining to catch fragments. Every syllable confirmed what they already suspected. Authority was splintering in real time. The boy sat motionless, earbuds dangling unused around his neck. His face carried no smirk, no outward challenge, only a calm that seemed to absorb the storm. Inside, his thoughts whispered, "He can shout in a cockpit just as he shouted at me. The louder he yells, the smaller he becomes." Across the aisle, a teenage girl clutched her father's arm. "Dad, is it safe?" Her father, a man in a gray suit, exhaled heavily, eyes narrowing at the sealed cockpit. "It's not the plane I'm worried about. It's him." The boy heard it. So did others. And suddenly silence in the cabin shifted. What was once fear became judgment, and judgment became quiet rebellion. The captain's voice cut through again, louder this time, rage unfiltered. You think passengers will side with him? He's nothing, just a boy who doesn't know his place. Gasps rippled. The words hadn't been meant for the cabin, but walls are thin at 30,000 feet. Passengers exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others muttering beneath their breath. The boy's fingers traced the seam of the seat pocket where his boarding pass rested. His mind sharpened. You tried to erase me with words, but now your words erase you. The turbulence returned, this time rougher. The plane jolted, oxygen masks rattling faintly above. A few passengers cried out, clutching armrests. Fear spiked, but so did anger. Because turbulence in the air was easier to stomach than turbulence in authority. One man, broad-shouldered and weathered, stood halfway from his seat before his wife tugged him back down. He glared toward the cockpit door, muttering, "He doesn't deserve to fly this plane." The murmurs grew louder, threading together until the silence of before became a low, united hum. The boy, still seated, became the eye of the storm. Passengers glanced at him not with pity but with recognition. His stillness was louder than any outburst could be. Inside the cockpit, the argument reached a sharp crack. The first officer's voice, firm and resolute, carried clearly this time. "Step aside, Captain. This isn't your command anymore." The words hit the cabin like a verdict. Every passenger froze. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, then opened them again. And in that simple act, it was as if the cabin collectively breathed with him. The authority that once loomed above had fractured. And everyone knew cracks only grow. A low hum of voices spread through the cabin, faint at first, almost imperceptible. Then it grew. Passengers sharing observations, murmuring outrage, questioning the man who had shouted at a child. The boy remained seated, composed. His folded boarding pass rested on his lap, a small emblem of resistance. Eyes around him flickered toward him as if seeking confirmation that standing up quietly was enough. In row 21, a young man leaned over his wife. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "That kid?" He didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied softly. "He's not afraid." The pilot, still locked in the cockpit, could not see the change. His authority had been physical, uniform, wings, voice. But the moral authority? That belonged to everyone else in the cabin now. And the boy had claimed it. A child in the row behind the teen clutched a stuffed bear, eyes wide. The mother whispered, "Sometimes the quietest people are the strongest." The engines hummed steadily, a constant reminder that the world outside the cabin remained unchanged, indifferent. But inside, the atmosphere was charged with electric anticipation. Judgment was no longer private. It was communal. The captain's footsteps echoed again as he paced the cockpit. Passengers could hear his sharp commands and muttered curses. Words flew, but the force behind them had diminished. Authority without respect is brittle. One passenger, a middle-aged woman with spectacles, stood up slowly, hand raised. Her voice trembled at first. I think the kid's right. You can't treat people like this." Heads turned, eyes widened. The ripple grew. A man a few rows forward cleared his throat and spoke softly. "She's right." The teen glanced at the movement, a faint nod acknowledging the courage spreading quietly but rapidly. The subtle rebellion was contagious. The cabin, once fearful, now hummed with unity. The crumpled boarding pass remained in his lap, a symbol he didn't need to explain. It represented resilience, proof that even a small act of dignity could inspire many. The first officer's voice echoed from the intercom again. "Captain, follow instructions. Grounding is immediate. Cooperation required." The passengers felt it in the weight of his words, finality. But the cabin no longer feared. They were witnesses, participants in the dismantling of unchecked arrogance. The boy inhaled slowly, the smallest smile touching his lips. It was quiet but unmistakable. The air itself seemed to acknowledge the shift, the storm of intimidation breaking into calm awareness. Somewhere in the middle of the plane, a young woman raised her phone, ready to record the moment. Not for shock or gossip, but for evidence, for testimony. The captain, pacing furiously in the cockpit, could feel the loss even without seeing it. His shadow of control had collapsed in rows 12 through 31. The weight of 1,000 silent judgments pressed against the door. The teen's presence, unwavering, had transformed whispers into a chorus, and now the cabin waited for the next move, the moment when patience would meet reckoning. The cabin was no longer merely a place of transit. It had become a crucible of silent defiance. Each passenger, from the window seat to the aisle, felt the shift in energy, a subtle but undeniable rebellion. The boy leaned back in his seat, observing. His calm was magnetic, a quiet lighthouse in the storm of authority. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a spectacle, yet the atmosphere moved in tandem with his presence. A woman in row 14 slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, standing just slightly. Her husband reached for her arm. "Sit," he whispered, but she shook her head gently. "No, it's time someone speaks." Nearby, a teenage boy nudged his mother. "He's right, Mom, this isn't fair." The mother's eyes flickered to the teen in row 17. She nodded, quietly affirming her child's instincts. Around them, the whispers, once tentative, began forming patterns of murmured agreement, fragmented sentences linking together like chains. He cannot intimidate them forever, the boy thought. Arrogance collapses under scrutiny. From the cockpit, muffled sounds of frustrated commands filtered down. The captain was pacing, tapping a foot, hands clenched into fists. Each shout, each barked order carried less weight. Every second that passed without compliance chipped at his authority. The boy's hand brushed against the folded boarding pass again, a small reminder that dignity, even when compressed into paper or silence, could remain intact. A flight attendant approached the teen, unsure whether to act or stay silent. She stopped mid-aisle, exchanging a glance with him. His eyes conveyed a single message: "You know what's right. Follow it." The cabin seemed to inhale collectively. Another whisper broke the tension. "He's been wronged." "Yes," another voice agreed. "And it's not just him." The murmurs swelled, becoming coherent, louder, though still soft enough not to provoke outright conflict. It was enough. The unity was building, like a wave gathering strength before it crashes on the shore. The teen's gaze flicked around the cabin. He saw the subtle nods, the stifled coughs of agreement, the half-raised fists pressed to laps in solidarity. Every silent gesture reinforced the growing force of resistance. From the cockpit, a sharp exhale. The captain slammed a hand on the console. "Control!" he shouted, voice brittle, nearly cracking. But the cabin remained undaunted. The first officer's words echoed through the intercom. "Sir, comply. Grounding is non-negotiable." The boy's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't need to shout. His calm defiance, mirrored by the passengers, spoke louder than any command. The pilot's panic, now audible in every clumsy word, reflected his loss of dominion. At the back, a young woman raised her phone slightly again, capturing the scene. Not for spectacle, but for proof, for history. Every frame recorded the imbalance of power tipping. The arrogance shrinking, the dignity rising. The engines thrummed steadily, indifferent to human quarrels, but inside the fuselage, the atmosphere had transformed. This was no longer a plane carrying passengers. It was a vessel of witness, each soul a quiet sentinel of truth. And in the midst of it all, the teen remained the calm center, his silence louder than any yell, his presence more commanding than any uniform. The airplane's steady hum filled the cabin, yet every person aboard felt the world shift beneath the surface. Row 17 had become the epicenter of a growing storm. No longer was this merely a flight. It was a crucible of judgment, where power and dignity collided in slow, irresistible force. The captain, still pacing in the cockpit, could not perceive the changes in the fuselage behind him. He barked into the microphone, words jagged with desperation. "I am in control. I will not have my authority questioned." The intercom crackled as the first officer intervened, firm, unwavering. "Sir, all commands must follow air traffic instructions. Grounding is immediate. Compliance required." The words, crisp and measured, reverberated in the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, leaning forward instinctively. The authority of the captain, once towering and unassailable, now seemed fragile and hollow. Whispers began soft at first. "Did you hear that? He's losing it. A child. A child just stared him down." The teen remained perfectly still, his folded boarding pass resting neatly in his lap. His calm demeanor, in contrast to the captain's unraveling fury, commanded attention without effort. Every subtle gesture, every controlled breath radiated confidence and quiet authority. He is not afraid. He cannot be erased. A flight attendant returned, a small device in her hands, a tablet connected to the cockpit microphone. She placed it gently on the bulkhead console. The cabin instinctively leaned in, murmuring, "What is that?" Someone whispered. "This," said another, eyes widening, "is proof." The device transmitted every word from the cockpit, unfiltered. Every threat, every insult, every bite of arrogance the captain had directed toward the teen became audible to the passengers. His shouting, his panic, his loss of composure, no longer private, was now public spectacle. The cabin held its collective breath. Mothers clutched children. Businessmen stopped typing. Teenagers removed earbuds, all drawn in by the revelation. The man who had humiliated a boy in front of strangers was now exposed for who he truly was. The teen's eyes swept the room. He caught the subtle nods, the stifled whispers of agreement, the small fists pressed into laps in solidarity. He was not alone. The passengers, silent until now, were now witnesses and participants in dismantling unchecked arrogance. A man in row 12 muttered, "This is unbelievable. How can he behave like this?" A mother shook her head, whispering, "I can't believe we were supposed to trust him with our lives." The murmurs grew, connecting, threading into something cohesive. The cabin vibrated with quiet moral outrage, a collective judgment stronger than any uniform or title. The captain's face drained of color as he realized his every word, meant to command fear and respect, was now evidence against him. His hands clenched into fists on the console, his voice rising, but the weight of it had dissipated. He was no longer a figure of authority. He was the spectacle. The teen's hand brushed the folded boarding pass again, his fingers pressing it flat, reaffirming his dignity. That small paper, once crumpled, now symbolized something larger than the cabin could contain. Resilience in the face of humiliation. Proof that even a single act of composure could inspire a crowd. Passengers leaned closer, voices now bolder, though measured. "He's lying. You can't just humiliate a kid and get away with it. This is absurd. Look at him." The murmurs transformed into whispers of courage. Phones came out, some recording for accountability, some silently capturing the testament of quiet defiance. Each frame, each clip, told the story of arrogance stripped bare and dignity preserved. The first officer's calm voice cut through. "Captain, cooperate. Grounding is immediate. Do not resist." The cabin now knew without question. The pilot's authority was shattered. The teen's presence, quiet, unwavering, dignified, was the fulcrum upon which the balance had shifted. Passengers, some who had been frozen in fear, now leaned forward instinctively. They were no longer passive. They were witnesses, judges, participants. A mother, eyes wet with quiet tears, whispered to her son, "Sometimes the quietest people are the strongest." The boy, seated across the aisle, nodded minutely, acknowledgement passing between generations, small but heavy with meaning. The captain pressed against the cockpit window, face pale, muttering under his breath. Every syllable that once carried authority now echoed as desperation. The uniform, polished shoes, and wings glimmered like ornaments, symbols stripped of their power by truth. The teen leaned back, calm, observing. Around him, passengers nodded subtly to each other, murmured affirmations, half smiles of recognition passing silently like a wave. The cabin breathed collectively, every individual contributing to the invisible force now pressing against the broken authority in the cockpit. The plane, engines steady and indifferent, became a vessel of moral reckoning. Every witness in the cabin understood it. Arrogance cannot survive exposure. And in the eye of this storm, the teen remained the center, the axis of calm that turned whispers into judgment and judgment into an unstoppable current. The intercom crackled again. The first officer speaking. "Sir, you are to comply immediately. Grounding is final. No further attempts at command will be tolerated." The cabin collectively exhaled. This was the tipping point. The teen's quiet defiance had catalyzed the passengers' moral authority. The arrogance that once loomed large now cowered under the weight of witness, judgment, and exposure. And in that moment, the entire plane seemed to lean forward, suspended in anticipation, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the man who had shouted at a child, ready for the reckoning that was about to unfold. The hum of the engines provided an indifferent soundtrack, unaware of the drama unfolding inside. The cabin, however, was alive with tension. Every passenger felt the shift in power, the invisible but palpable change in atmosphere that told them this was no ordinary flight. The captain's voice bellowed through the intercom, sharp and brittle. "Sit down. Stay seated. I am in command." A few passengers flinched, startled by the ferocity, but most remained rooted, faces hard, eyes unyielding. His words carried no weight anymore. Authority without respect was nothing more than noise echoing against the walls of the cabin without effect. The teen remained seated, his posture impeccable, hands folded atop the crumpled boarding pass. Calm radiated from him in waves, magnetic and unyielding. He didn't need to raise his voice, his presence alone was enough. The murmurs that had been tentative whispers in previous moments grew stronger. "Enough." Someone whispered, barely audible, yet it triggered recognition. "This has gone too far." Another voice joined. "He humiliated a child." "In front of everyone." The whispers connected, forming an undercurrent that ran the length of the cabin. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Businessmen leaned forward and teenagers removed earbuds, all drawn by the same realization. The captain had lost his moral authority and the teen had claimed it silently, flawlessly. The first officer's voice, calm and resolute, echoed through the intercom again. "Captain, comply immediately. Grounding is non-negotiable." The captain slammed a fist on the console, pacing furiously, each step resonating with desperation. "I'm in control. I will not be undermined." But the cabin was no longer listening to his commands, they were listening to his collapse. Every passenger felt it. The man who had shouted, humiliated, and asserted arrogance had been stripped bare. A mother in row 14 raised her voice, shaking slightly, her courage mounting. "You have no right. He's just a boy and you've humiliated him." The words acted like a spark. One by one, passengers began speaking. A businessman leaned over, voice firm. "This behavior is unacceptable." "Step aside." Another mother, clutching her daughter, added, "This isn't just a flight, this is accountability." The cabin transformed. No longer silent observers, the passengers were active participants in the dismantling of authority. Their collective judgment, previously quiet, now became a force impossible to ignore. The teen's eyes swept across the cabin. Each nod, each whispered affirmation, each small gesture of solidarity reinforced his quiet strength. He was not alone. The passengers, once subdued by fear and submission, now mirrored his composure and courage. From the cockpit, the captain's face appeared in the small window, pale and furious. His eyes darted nervously as he saw subtle defiance in every row. The uniform, wings, and polished shoes, symbols of former authority, now seemed meaningless, hollow ornaments exposed by truth. He pounded the console again. His voice cracked, strained, raw. "You will obey. You will remain seated." A teenage girl standing slightly with her phone raised to record shouted, "We are witnesses. You can't intimidate us." The boy, seated calmly, leaned back, lifting the folded boarding pass slightly in his hand. It was a subtle act, but it symbolized the unbroken dignity that had inspired the cabin. All eyes followed. The passengers absorbed the message, their own courage amplified by his quiet resistance. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, elderly passengers, all began asserting themselves. Not with chaos, but with moral clarity. The murmurs were now an orchestrated chorus, a quiet revolution within the fuselage. The first officer's voice continued over the intercom, steady, unwavering. "Captain, compliance is mandatory. Grounding is in effect immediately." The captain pressed his forehead against the cockpit window, jaw tight, realizing the reality he could not deny. The moral authority had shifted. The teen sitting calmly had become the epicenter, the axis around which the passengers rallied. The plane tilted slightly as it adjusted for rerouting, but no turbulence outside could compare to the upheaval within. The passengers' collective gaze was a weight the captain could feel through the sealed door, every eye a mirror reflecting his arrogance, exposing every fracture. The teen inhaled slowly, holding the moment, letting the cabin witness the culmination of quiet defiance. The folded boarding pass pressed in his palm was more than paper. It was proof, a symbol, a small but potent emblem of resilience. The cabin collectively leaned in, almost as one organism. The murmurs became whispers, whispers became voices, voices became declarations. Each utterance chipped away at the captain's authority until it was unrecognizable, until it was gone. Finally, the captain slumped slightly, hand dropping from the console. He realized there was nothing left to command. Authority had shifted irrevocably. The teen's quiet presence, coupled with the passenger's unified moral stance, had dismantled what no single act of shouting or intimidation could. The teen's eyes flicked across the cabin, settling on each passenger, silently acknowledging their courage. And in that glance, every passenger understood. This was the reckoning, and it had arrived. The wheels of the plane touched the tarmac with a soft, controlled thud, but the passengers hardly noticed. The real landing had already occurred within the cabin, an emotional, moral descent where arrogance collided with dignity and came undone. The engines hummed steadily, tires gripping the runway, yet the silence inside was almost deafening. No one spoke at first. Every eye, every breath still hung on the aftermath of what had unfolded. The captain, now pale and subdued, pressed his palms against the console. His face was etched with exhaustion and humiliation. The first officer, composed, guided the plane toward the designated gate. No words of comfort, no gestures of authority, just precise professionalism. The teen remained seated, hands folded neatly over the boarding pass. He had been calm, silent, resilient, and now as the cabin exhaled collectively, his presence radiated quiet victory. Passengers exchanged subtle smiles, nods, and soft words of acknowledgement. Mothers whispered to children, "See? Calm courage wins." Teenagers leaned across seats murmuring appreciation. Even the adults, long accustomed to hierarchy and authority, nodded quietly to each other. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering reassurance. One leaned toward the teen, whispering, "You handled that with incredible dignity." He gave a faint nod, a small smile, acknowledging her words without distraction. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more, but it lacked conviction. "Please, disembark calmly." His words fell flat, hollow in the presence of collective judgment. No one moved with fear. No one flinched. Authority had lost its weight. The passengers, once passive observers, now walked with quiet pride. Each step was a small testament to the lessons learned mid-flight. Arrogance can collapse. Dignity can prevail, and collective observation can enforce justice without violence. Outside, the airport staff noticed the subtle tension as passengers exited. A few whispered to each other, unsure why the cabin seemed charged with something beyond relief. But those aboard the plane understood. The reckoning had not just been personal but moral. The teen stepped off last, boarding pass in hand, standing tall. Cameras flashed, not of ridicule but in documentation of courage under fire. Whispers followed him. He didn't flinch. He stayed calm. He showed us what dignity looks like. The captain remained behind the closed cockpit door, his uniform intact, but his reputation fractured. Every word he had shouted, every act of arrogance had been witnessed, recorded, and judged. He could not reclaim the moral high ground. Passengers began filing into the terminal, their voices blending into the low hum of the airport. But the lesson lingered, heavy and undeniable. Authority must be wielded with respect. Arrogance collapses under scrutiny, and dignity cannot be broken by mere shouting or threats. The teen walked forward, glancing once more at the plane. His eyes held calm triumph. No words were needed. His silence had spoken louder than any scream. The boarding pass, now folded neatly in his hand, symbolized more than travel. It symbolized proof of endurance, of quiet resistance, of poetic justice achieved. The plane would depart again, engines roaring, destinations shifting. But inside, the story of what had occurred mid-flight remained, immortalized in the passengers' memories, and in the quiet strength of one young teen who refused to be intimidated. And as the doors closed behind him, the cabin empty of witnesses, the lesson remained. Dignity withstands arrogance, silence carries power, and the smallest acts of courage can topple the tallest walls of entitlement.